Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. However, this video is not part of the regular series, the ones that I have numbered. Rather, it's a video, it was related to a request I received. The request asked me to talk about Jizamurai. So I'm going to make this video about Jizamurai because it's an interesting topic, and also we have a lot of videos about to come out in this series that involve very complicated and esoteric topics, etc., etc. So it'd be good to sort of do this video. I'm not going to say necessarily that this is an easy topic, but it's something that we can pretty much address one step at a time. So in other words, it's good sometimes to take a break from the topic to study something that's contextual but different. So with that, we'll proceed forward. And so, as I said, in this video we're going to examine the concept of country samurai. I will attempt to keep the video shorter than usual and try to hit the key points without too much side commentary. The video will probably still be long, but hopefully not as long as usual. Alright, so look at your screen, because to begin, in order to understand this concept of country samurai, we must understand these three terms: Kokujin, Jizamurai, and Goshi. So all of these terms theoretically could be translated as country samurai, but each one of them is uniquely different, or very different actually. And the first two, Kokujin and Jizamurai, really belong to a pre-Edo time period, and the term Goshi really it belongs into the Edo period. And I'll explain how this all goes together. But I need to point out here that when discussing Goshi, there's a lot of confusion about Goshi, and I will also try to clarify that as simply as possible. Okay, so the first term that we must start with is Kokujin, and this is true, and that means a local person. Kokujin literally means country person, or province person, territory person, but what it means is a local, a person who's from the area. And in terms of samurai rank and status, a kokujin is a local samurai official who is assigned an area to govern by the governor of the province, by the shugo. So the shogunate gives the province to the shugo. The shugo breaks the province into pieces and assigns kokujin families to govern each of those pieces. So it's a ruling samurai clan from the area who is assigned to govern the area. And like I said, these families are picked because they are locals. The shugo may or may not be from the province. They oftentimes were not from the province. So in order to govern the province effectively, that's why they picked local kokujin, local samurais, to govern the province. So each shugo would have multiple kokujin underneath them, each of those kokujin families governing a portion of the province. And I also want to point out again, a kokujin family, it's not just one kokujin governing the province, it's a clan governing the province. It's a kokujin family. And then that family will need to have retainers. And so that's when we start getting into the term that's coming up next, which is Jizamurai. Okay, now that you understand what the shugo and the kokujin are, now is when you can understand correctly what a Jizamurai is. So the Jizamurai are the samurai who served the kokujin. So during the pre-Edo period, this means that these samurai can come from actual bushi families, that is gentry, right? Descended from the Genji, the Heishi, etc. They can come from gentry families. Or they can be local farmers, for example, who earn their status by the kokujin. In other words, I hate to use European terms, but you can almost think of it like the kokujin knighted these farmers to become samurai. So does that hopefully that makes sense. So the Jizamurai can be other gentry families, other bushi families from the area. They can also be peasants who are then given status in order to become samurai, in order to serve that military function. Okay, but another key point here though is to remember that these samurai, whether they are gentry samurai or they are sort of earned their status as samurai, they also have to sort of farm the area as well. All right, but don't mistake this for militarized farmers, because militarized farmers, that's a different group of people. That's a non-samurai group of people. It's a different term. We're talking about jizamurai. So these are gentry, local bushi, gentry families, and or local peasants who were given samurai status, and they are the warriors of the area, but they also run the farms. Okay? They also collected the taxes from the local farmers. These samurai are pretty much only on the radar of the Kokujin. So in terms of power and structure, you know, you have the Shugo, who's the provincial governor, but many times the Shugo isn't tracking the Jizamurai because it's the job of the Kokujin to track the Jizamurai. So the Shugo is the provincial governor. He keeps track of the Kokujin, and then the Kokujin keep track of local gentry families and peasants that they've turned into samurai families. So the Jizamurai are the responsibility of the Kokujin, and the Kokujin are the responsibility of the Shugo. So let's be very clear here. Jizamurai role is a samurai role. One has to understand that even if the person starts out as a farmer or a merchant, once they obtain service under the Kokujin, they become samurai. They begin collecting taxes. They are also responsible for military service. At that point, they're not a peasant anymore. They're a samurai at that point, right? They are warriors. They are tax collectors. They are overseers of local farms. They serve and answer directly to the Kokujin. They are now part of the samurai hierarchy. They may not have Bushi blood or Bushi clan descent. So they're not gentry, they're not bushi, but they are samurai. And this is where it can be a little confusing because, you know, from the Edo period, it's like you have to be bushi and you have to be samurai. But remember, this is pre-Edo. So you can be a samurai without being a bushi, without being gentry. And I think that's what confuses a lot of people. But anyway, that is the reality of the Jizamurai. Some Jizamurai are descended from Bushi. Some of them are merchants and farmers who obtained the role of samurai. These guys also, these Jizamurai also have to train some of the locals to take up arms when war broke out. And these locals serve as a type of auxiliary force that accompany the Jizamurai when the Jizamurai has to be deployed. So these are the militarized peasants. The militarized peasants are not samurai. They're not gentry, they're not bushi, they're not samurai from gaining the status. They are peasants who have been trained to serve as auxiliary military forces. So the Shugo controls the Kokujin controls the Jizamurai, and the Jizamurai control the local peasant militias. And as I mentioned in my uprising video, because if you guys follow my channel, I did a very long video on uprisings and riots where I talked about Kokujin and Jizamurai leading Iki groups. And so this is another thing where people sort of get confused. They always think that the Iki groups are peasant uprisings, but they're not really peasant uprisings. They are during the Sengoku period, during the pre-Edo times. Most of the uprisings were actually run by Jizamurai and by Kokujin, and they used large groups of militarized peasants for the overall force multiplying power. They needed large groups of people, so they used peasants for the muscle. But the uprisings are actually held by the Jizamurai and by the Kokujin 99.9% of the time. So during the end of the Sengoku period, or that transition from the Sengoku into the Edo period, the Jizamurai, as they existed in this Kokujin-Jizamurai relationship, essentially fade away. And they're replaced by other groups, and we'll get into that next. That's going to be the Goshi, and we'll talk about that next. The Jizamurai either had to commit to being samurai or they had to let go of that samurai role and fall back into the peasant status. Those that fell back into peasant status often took the role of village heads. Now, I also discussed this in the uprising video as well. I recommend that you go back and watch the uprising video because I talked about Kokujin, Jizamurai, the village heads, the different ranks of the village heads, things like that. That's all in the uprising video. Generally speaking, those families that were bushi by blood, or they were by clan, they were gentry, they were bushi. Those families tended to maintain their place as samurai. But a lot of the samurai, a lot of the Jizamurai who were peasants or merchants that became samurai for the Sengoku period, for example, a lot of them just fell back into being peasants. But they don't go back to being just peasants. They go back to being peasants of extremely high rank. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Well, let's talk about it now. There's a term called hyakusho, and hyakusho actually means like having a last name. The term refers to like having hundreds of names, etc. But the point means is that the hyakusho are basically people that they're the highest ranks of farmers or the highest ranking peasants, and they work directly with the samurai. As I said, many of them come from Jizamurai families. So, for example, during the Sengoku period, maybe they were farmers who then rose up and became samurai, and then they became hyakusho during the beginning of the Edo period. So they're very, very high-ranking farmers, and they have a considerable amount of power and authority. And in some cases, they didn't even have to pay certain taxes. So this is pretty much, so the Kokujin Jizamurai of the pre-Edo, this is pretty much what happened to them. The Bushi gentry ones pretty much maintained their existence as samurai. We'll get into that in a minute. But many of them just reverted back to peasants, but high-ranking, very powerful peasants. Now I have to take the minute to correct myself. I had mentioned in my slides and throughout this entire presentation in my slides, any place where I write or mention the term hyakusho, you, the viewer, need to understand that what I really mean is the full term of Samurai Bun Hyakusho. Hyakusho, which, as I was mentioning, means hundreds of names. That's what the term means. It means hundreds and hundreds of names. It refers to the peasants. So I use the term Hyakusho in this context to refer to Samurai Bun Hyakusho, but I get a little sloppy and a little lazy and I just say Hyakusho. Sort of assuming that you, the viewer, are understanding that I'm saying Samurai Bun Hyakusho. But I don't make that very clear. So I need you, the viewer, to understand that any place where I say hyakusho, I'm saying samurai bun hyakusho, or peasants that were samurai, or peasants that are descended from samurai. So, and I apologize anywhere in this video where I get a little sloppy and just lazily say hyakusho, I apologize. I mean samurai bun hyakusho. So please understand that for the entire video. And as you can read on your screen, at this point the term Jizamurai essentially lost all specific meaning. It was used at that point to pretty much refer to either samurai who are stationed in country locations. We'll get back to that in a minute. Or it can refer to samurai who are just simply less refined. In that case, it's almost like an insult. But sometimes it's a little legit though, because if a samurai is stationed in an area that's far from cultural hubs, they're going to be less refined. So again, Jizamurai sort of loses its specific meaning at this point, and during the Edo period, this particular term, Jizamurai, pretty much refers to people who are stationed out in the country, or as an insult, refers to basically like country bumpkins, people that don't have a lot of refinement or culture. And that is because in the Edo period, a new term takes over, new realities kick in. So now that we've sort of made clarity as to what the Kokujin and Jizamurai were and what their relationship was, it's time to look at Goshi. Now Goshi also means country samurai, but again, Goshi is pronounced differently than Jizamurai, and it uses different kanji. It is a different term. So you can see the term on your screen now, Goshi, country samurai of the Edo period. Different kanji, pronounced differently. This is not the same as Jizamurai. We already talked about Jizamurai and its interrelationship with Kokujin. Now we're talking about Goshi. So first and foremost, let's get this out of the way. There's actual Goshi, and then there's fake Goshi. People who are not actually Goshi, And this is where a lot of people get confused. But I need to be very clear. There is an actual legal definition of goshi, and then there are people that use goshi like as a slang. So let's look at the real goshi first. And to sum it up, let's just be direct and blunt. Goshi is a samurai who is recognized by the province's lord as samurai, as bushi, as gentry, as samurai. But the province either has no use for them or they don't really want to pay them anything. As such, they, the goshi, end up living on a farm and they have to farm. And they wait on standby in case they might be needed for something someday. And I really should say full stop at this point, because at that point that's what a goshi is. We're done. That's it. That's goshi. But let's discuss it some more, because there are other things to go over to explain that better and to also clarify some confusion. So now that we've defined goshi, as a samurai who has no purpose, so is stuck on a farm waiting for orders or waiting for a purpose to appear. Now, they are 100% samurai, and I cannot emphasize this even more. A lot of people make this mistake. They are 100% samurai. They are bushi. They are a gentry clan. They are bushi. They are 100% samurai. They just don't have a place or purpose, and so they are literally just tucked away on a farm somewhere waiting for the day that they might have some purpose. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that. That's pretty straightforward, but it gets complicated, so let's keep going. So again, let's just look, where do they come from? How do you get a goshi? Well, remember when I said that a lot of those G samurai had to either become hyakusho or they maintain themselves as samurai? Well, those guys and gals many of them became goshi. That's what happens to them. So they do not fall back into being peasants. Or they were bushi gentry and they refuse to be, to fall from gentry to peasantry. But they don't really have a place. So now they're goshi. You also have samurai who were dismissed or come from fallen houses. So their clan, somebody is dismissed from service, or they were defeated in a war. Their territory their clan fell during battle. They still have land and money, and they have their genealogy. They just don't have a purpose. Nobody really has a use for them. So they just live in some country manor farming, waiting for somebody to want their services again. And so basically it's just samurai who don't have a role anymore, right? They have the genealogy, they have land, they have money, they have houses and servants, but nobody has a use for them. And that's pretty much the goshi. So let's look at a couple of examples. So many of the samurai from the Omi province became goshi when the changeover from the Sengoku to Edo took place. Some gave up and became hyakusho. Some held out and maintained their samurai status. And at this point, I need to be very clear. A lot of people believe that the law and edicts at the changeover of the Edo period, Toyotomi stuff, Tokugawa stuff, etc., were final, and that, if you weren't a samurai at that exact moment, you lost your status forever. That's just not true. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But anyway, we'll get back to that. But the point is that in the Omi province, for example, a lot of these families either became hyakusho or they became goshi. And the lords assigned to the province acknowledged their samurai status. They acknowledged their money and their farms and their manors and their genealogies and their warrior skills, but they didn't have any money for them, or they had no idea what to do with them. So they literally just let them live in the countryside as goshi, samurai without a purpose. If the lord from a domain was kicked another example, if the lord from a domain was kicked out by the shogunate, many of the retainers would fall into ronin and or goshi status. And this is an important part, because some of you listening may have said, hey, what's the relationship between ronin and goshi? And that's actually on point. So if your family became a goshi family, maybe like the heads of the family would be living at the manor, but many of the sons and cousins and nephews, they may very well just go out and be ronin. right? So there is a relationship between Goshi and Ronin. But important to remember this, no matter what, they are always samurai. They are still samurai. Some people get confused on this, and so let's explain that some more. First, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that, again, as I said earlier, if you're not a full employed samurai at the start of the Edo period, then you lost your status forever. And that's just simply not true. Maybe I'll make a video in the future explaining how and why this is false, but for now, I'm just going to say that's not true. That's a mistaken belief. And if you have that mistaken belief, then of course things aren't going to make sense. The reality was it's not that definitive. It's not that sharp. So the second point where a lot of people get very confused, and I put this in red because this is where it does get rather complicated. Some Goshi actually sign up for Ashigaru positions in shogunate forces because it was easier and or more lucrative than living in the countryside. So you had samurai. Now these are people who are samurai by genealogy, by clanology. You know, their family has has a manor on some farmland out in the whatever country backwoods of such province. They are bushi, they are samurai, but they sign up to be ashigaru. Now this is what confuses a lot of people because a lot of people don't understand that you can be serving an ashigaru level role, but you may be bushi. This, honestly, for you shinobi enthusiasts, this is how you get a lot of shinobi who are serving as ashigaru level roles, but they come from samurai families. Because a lot of people are like, well, if the shinobi is serving an ashigaru role, then he's not a samurai. And it's like, well, no, that's not how that works. If he's Goshi, which most shinobi families ended up being Goshi. That's very common among samurai families to end up as Goshi. So if you're Goshi, you're samurai. So you're a samurai who knows shinobi no jutsu. But you want or need a job that is an ashigaru level job. So even though you're bushi, you take an ashigaru level job. So your job is an ashigaru level job, but you are bushi. And that confuses the piss out of a lot of people because they don't understand how this works. But simply put, a Goshi who is a bushi can get a job, get an ashigaru level job. In fact, this was very common in the Higo province. So if you want to research, go to the Higo province and you'll see that it was quite common for bushi in the Higo, for Goshi in the Higo province to serve as ashigaru level positions. Some merchants purchased the right to wear two swords, and they would use the term Goshi as a slang, but they weren't real Goshi. So this also throws people, confuses people too. A true Goshi is a bushi, is a samurai, but merchants could purchase the right to wear two swords, and when they did that, as a slang, they called themselves Goshi, but it wasn't legally binding. They were not actually Goshi. It was a slang term. So that's two confusing points. Here's another point that's a little confusing for people. There are a couple of cases where certain lords would pull individuals from the hyakusho back into Goshi roles. It's almost like they were saving them by restoring their samurai status. For example, their grandfather gave up the status and became a hyakusho, but now the lord is turning the grandson into a Goshi. Now, but it's important to remember, this was not seen as giving samurai status. It was seen as restoring the status or as correcting the status. And it didn't happen very often. It wasn't common, but it did happen sometimes. So let's make these following points very clear. Samurai, so like for example, samurai who have a role and a job and a purpose in the domain but are assigned to live in the country or have the freedom of choice to live in the country, they are not Goshi. They are the Jizamurai of the Edo period. Remember earlier when I said during the Edo period, Jizamurai just simply refers to samurai that are living in the country? That would be people that are on payroll with roles, with jobs. They're just assigned or choose to live in the country. Those would be Jizamurai. Those are not Goshi, because a Goshi is a person whose samurai gentry status is upheld, but they have no role in the clan. They have no role in the domain, and they have to live in the country, and they have to farm or be ronin or whatever. But they don't. Do you see the difference? So in the Edo period, Jizamurai is an official retainer with a purpose and a stipend that lives in the country. A Goshi is an acknowledged bushi who doesn't have a purpose or a role in the clan and just lives in the country somewhere. So we got to make sure that I have to make sure that you, the viewer, understand the difference. And now that we've gone through all of this to try to clarify the term, I have to make it even more complicated by saying the following. As the Edo period continued on and the politics and the economy developed, even the place and meaning of Goshi shifted. So the Goshi who started off as samurai who lived and farmed in the countryside waiting for some kind of military orders, as time changed, the Goshi did begin to pick up work and obtain usage by the domain governments. Many Goshi even ended up being something similar to the Jizamurai. So we had the Kokujin Jizamurai relationships and roles. Those faded, gave rise to the Goshi, but then Goshi kind of started to turn back into the Jizamurai, meaning that you were employed, you did have a use, you did have a job, but you were out in the countryside. So while some Goshi remained hermits or the gentry farmers awaiting orders, some Goshi actually got pretty decent assignments, and some Goshi ended up being in charge of large groups of people. So that's another factor of Goshi. When we're talking about the bushi living in the countryside with no use, waiting for orders, that's, the beginning of the Edo period, but then that shifts, like I just said, that shifts almost back to the Jizamurai term. So that transition is extremely complicated, and since this video is already really long, we're just going to include this slide and pretty much sum it up and end it here. Okay, so now we're at the end of the video, and hopefully this clarifies the concept of country samurai for many of the viewers. So in particular, I hope it clarifies the Goshi role, what a Goshi is. I've seen way too many people misunderstand and misuse the term Goshi. A Goshi is absolutely a samurai. They could be working and working as an ashigaru, but even if they're doing that, they are still gentry. They're still bushi. They're still samurai. They're just a bushi who's serving a ashigaru role, but they still have the genealogy and the bushi acknowledgement that they are bushi. They're not ashigaru. Merchants who use the term Goshi as a slang, they're not actually Goshi. It's not a real legal designation, and don't let their usage of the term Goshi confuse you. It's not real. So, and also because, I refer to so many, samurai manuals, we'll end this on this note that several samurai hermits, Goshis living out in the woods, many of them are the authors of a lot of the samurai manuals, right? So you have these Goshi that are living out in the countryside somewhere, and they don't really have a purpose. They don't really have any employment or purpose of the time, so they write the manuals. And you find a lot of manuals are written by these they live as these hermit farmers, but even though they're living as these hermit farmers, they are still bushi. So, and like I said, there are many manuals written by these guys. And that is it for this video. As always, these videos are meant to be brief, and they are meant to inspire you or to give you a starting off point. The material in this video is copywritten by me, so please do not steal this material. Please do not take it. Please do not copy it. Again, I hope it inspires you. I hope that it sets you off on your own investigations and explorations.